here to you. I see God in symmetry. I see God in our make-believe. I see God in our grand attempts to make something beautiful before life ends. I see God in our irony, in fragile heirlooms within children's reach. I see God in our damaged good, but you see God in ways I wish I could. You see God in ways that I wish I could. Without instruction, without obstruction, you believe. Without container or dualistic framework, you see the Holy Ghost in broad daylight, and I see the reflection in your eyes. I see God in healing bones, in the sanctuary of our homes. And I see God in the wilderness, in our magnetism to recklessness. Black or white or vivid color, after a while it all runs together. Stained glass means nothing without light. And I see God in our damaged good, but you see God in ways I wish I could. Yeah, you see God in ways that I wish I could. Without assurance, without insurance, you believe. Without condition or the promise of heaven, you see the Holy Ghost in broad daylight. I see the reflection in your eyes. I see the reflection in your eyes. I see the reflection in your eyes.
morning and welcome to Watershed. Wherever you're joining us from, whether you're outside enjoying this beautiful weather, or you're inside with us, or if you're online, just say hello or say where you're joining from if you're online. But we're grateful you chose to be with us today. Please stand and join us as we sing.
keeper, protector. It is you that holds us together when everything else fails us. It is you that holds us together.
All right. If I talk, will I sound more like you? Because that would be a good thing. Even better. Let's try that again. My name is Matt, and I'm one of the co-pastors here at Watershed. Welcome this morning, those of you who are joining us in our physical space here, or whether you're on YouTube or Facebook, or those of you who are outside underneath the canopy of the trees enjoying this wonderful morning. Just real quick, before I kind of get going in talking about some things that are opportunistic for you here in the weeks ahead, could I invite you to pull out your cell phone? And if you already have the Watershed app, could I ask you to open that up for just a moment? I want to kind of take us on a little bit of a journey this morning with some of our technology. If you don't have the Watershed app, I would really encourage you to download that. There is a world of things that are accessible because of this beautiful piece of technology. On the app, maybe you see a panel that says Sunday announcements, and everything that I'm going to be talking about this morning is actually accessible to that particular panel. The ways of signing up, being informed, you can start there. But then there are other aspects of this our Watershed app that I want to point to this morning. First of all, I want to let you know that if you are brand new with us, in fact, I talked with a couple of different folks as they were coming in this morning. If you're brand new with us and you're wondering, what is it that is accessible to me that allows me to kind of get started here, help me understand my spiritual journey, helps me understand what it means for my religious past or my experiences to integrate into who Watershed, not just who Watershed is, but who Watershed is becoming, because so much of how we see the world is who we are today is probably going to be different than who we're going to be 5 years from now. That's kind of built into our DNA. Preface 1.0 and Preface 2.0 are environments that really help you become acclimated to not just how you see yourself fitting in, but then who we are as a community. As a matter of fact, the next Preface 1.0 is taking place September 15th. I think that's a Wednesday evening. It's 3 Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. These continue to be virtual spaces through Zoom. It allows a multitude of people to access us that way, whether you live in Indian Trail, which shout out to Indian Trail this morning because somebody from Indian Trail showed up, whether that's Denver or Rock Hill or some other part of the United States, because we have folks that are dialing into us from those regions as well. As a matter of fact, I think somebody from Jacksonville, Florida is showing up in our next preface. And so I just want to read you, and you can actually touch the screen and see this for yourself in the preface panel. But here's just a little, I guess, wetting of the whistle in terms of what you're going to be signing up for. So week 1 is something called Introduction to the Theology of Trampolining. That sounds interesting, right? Freezing the frame and other spiritual technologies, or I would insert interesting technologies. Week 3, the 5th act play and the Bible. So you're like, I have no idea what any of that means, and I'm not going to tell you because that's a bit of a teaser. But if that creates some interest or curiosity and you're wanting to find more traction here, please access that preface panel, or you can do it in the announcement panel as well and sign up for Preface 1.0. Also, whether you're brand new or whether you've been coming for a while, I think it's the 18th, Tuesday the 18th, so it's a week from this Tuesday night, is something called Reclamation. If you're enjoying the experience of this current series, Textuality, man, you're going to love Reclamation. David Roberts, who's our kind of a resident theologian, student pastor, pastor of social justice here at Watershed. He hosts this 4-week experience. He does it about every other month, and he walks our community, anyone who's interested in kind of deeper dives into theology or doctrine or Bible. He walks them through the process of reclaiming some of those ideas, some of those aspects that maybe we're struggling to understand as we move into this space together in community. It's a lot of fun. It's very informative. It's interactive. You can sign up regardless of where you are in the progression of calling Watershed home. Also, I want to let you know that on August 29th is our end of summer bash. It's kind of a party on the lawn, so there's going to be food trucks and probably some music, might even be some live music, games for both kids and adults. There's I think there's like a bouncy slide. I think that's just for the kids. All right, so don't get your hopes up there. All right, maybe a few of you can. We'll see. All right, no promises. But that's happening August 29th here on the lawn. It should be a lot of fun. And then finally, again, I want to, if I can. There we go. I want to direct your attention to the giving tab. Every week we stand up and we talk about what it means for this to be a generous community. And I wanted to point to this with you this morning for just a moment, because part of, I think, what helps create clarity and what is a motivating factor for someone to consider their resources as a part of a church is knowing exactly what that does. And so on the giving tab, you can actually see this is what happens when you or I are generous with our resources here. My family has been practicing generosity, not just at Watershed, but towards the church for the better part of over 2 decades now, and certainly here at Watershed. And part of what is motivating for us is knowing that when we give, when our family gives here, we know that that fuels the work of liberation, transformation, and reclamation. Many of us in this space have benefited from that work here at Watershed. It resources efforts to stand in solidarity with our marginalized neighbors. That's the ongoing work of allowing our generosity to create some sort of activation or help or solidarity with our surrounding neighborhoods or communities. It paves the way for healing, awakening, and hope for your Watershed siblings and community. When someone stands up on a Sunday and does a "What's Saving You Now" sort of testimony type presentation, you're seeing that in real time. You're seeing the intersection of their life and the relationships and the energy within this space, and that being transformative. It prepares a generation of students and children to grow in a relationship with God, themselves, each other, and the world. And I would add to that in ways that are free from some of the trappings that we're working through as adults. It also provides a fair and sustainable wage for our staff. It takes responsibility in the stewardship of the gift of physical space that we're afforded here in Chantilly and Plaza Midwood. Quick kind of commercial. We moved from a space just like you could throw a rock and hit the space that we used to occupy. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. It's right across Independence Parkway, which is behind us. And part of why we moved and we took on the endeavor of moving into this space was knowing that space, it was living on borrowed time. At some point, it was going to be sold out from underneath of us, and we would have no place to go. And so that's actually taking place. Like that space it's already been sold. That would have eventually happened. And now, not only do we have our own space that we get to utilize for what happens here, but more and more organizations, nonprofits that need just space to do their work are starting to utilize our rooms and our basement, and sometimes even this space. Recovery groups, kids groups, or organizations that are targeting kids in need. This is all happening throughout the course of Monday through Saturday, and sometimes even Sunday evenings. And I want to make you aware of that. This space is a gift that we get to give away that also benefits us, and stewarding that is really important. The last thing I would say is when I give, when our family gives, it reminds me that my money doesn't control me. And so there's all of these variables, and I'm not sure what motivates you or demotivates you when you start thinking about your resources and how that flows into other parts of the world, whether that's a nonprofit or here at Watershed. We want to just continue to hold out in the forefront. This is what it means when you're a part of the generous movement here at Watershed, and we, without apology, invite people into that. If you can do that on a regular basis, whether that's monthly or weekly, doesn't really matter where you start. You know, every amount is significant in terms of how we are grateful for what flows our way, even if it's a one-time gift. And you can access all the information you need, not only on this app, but if you want even more specifics around, all right, what does a budget look like, and what's accountability look like? All of those are open. All of those things are accessible to you. You can either email us, or you can go online and you can give securely on our website or in our giving app, or here on our Watershed app. So I know that was a little bit more than you're used to, but as we move into August, typically August, the end of July and August, we see sort of a dip as we move towards September, and hopefully September brings a different life or energy in this space. But things have been pretty reduced over the last 4 to 5 weeks. We want to make you aware of that, and then also let you know that that's an opportunity, especially if you're brand new, to begin to be a part of what's going on here. Thank you so much for being here today. Again, tons of great stuff happening, not just in the next few weeks, but also in the fall, more opportunities to connect, and more on that in the weeks ahead. Thanks.
So I lift my hands to the God that guides me, to the one that finds me. Even on my darkest days, he walks beside me singing songs of freedom, always singing songs of life. And they're bringing me out of the darkness, and they're leading me into the light. He never said it would be easy, no, he never said it would be safe. My hope, my hope, my hope, oh, ooh, 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 oh, my hope, my hope, my hope, oh, ooh, 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 oh. None of the people on the streets hustling all day to go home and feed their families, just trying to make ends meet. They're grinding but they're finding that they're still facing defeat. None of the people that don't feel equal, working hard to pay the wages, others playing their casinos. Only the ones on the run, I hope they find the love they're looking for, the purpose they've been running from. My hope, my hope, my hope, oh, ooh, 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 whoa. My hope, my hope, my hope, oh, ooh, 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 whoa. He never said it would be easy, no. He never said it would be safe. He never said the path we're walking on, no, we wouldn't have hurdles to face. But the Lord did promise me freedom, and the Lord did promise me strength. He said we soar on wings of eagles and not grow weary or faint. My hope, my hope, my hope, oh, ooh, 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 whoa. My hope, my hope, my hope, oh, ooh, ooh, whoa. Tell them that there's hope in every situation, all this pain I'm facing. For every dream I'm chasing, there is hope. There is hope in every situation, all this pain I'm facing. For every generation, there is hope. My hope, my hope, my hope, oh, ooh, 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 whoa. My hope, my hope, my hope, oh, ooh, 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 whoa.
The stories of Ruth and Esther.
The way that Paul conceives of original sin and salvation in 1 Corinthians chapter 15.
Laws on sexual immorality. Because, we got a bunch of freaks in Watershed that need to get their act together.
The parable of the vineyard owner, Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16.
Jonah and the whale. Big fish. Whale?
In John 14, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. What does that even mean?
Good morning, welcome to Watershed. My name's Scott, I'm one of the pastors here, and it's really good to have you. And if you're sort of visiting for the first time or you're just jumping in the last couple weeks or so, we're in the throes of this series. We're asking questions about what does it mean to reclaim passages, or what does it mean to engage passages that maybe in our previous faith experience we saw as one way. And we're hoping, or we're believing that maybe there's a different way to see these texts, that there's more life to them, that there's maybe a way that was actually more ideal when they were originally written than how we have misconstrued them a couple thousand or 3,000 or 4,000 years later. And so each of us as a teaching team sort of sat for a minute and began to ask the question, what are some of these passages, what are some of these verses that have been helpful or maybe that have been unhelpful, and what does it mean to reimagine them? What does it mean to relook at, redesign, and reconsider that there might be an additional way or multiple ways in which we can come to some of these passages and reawake to how we see faith in God in the whole deal. And that's so much of what the work we feel like we are able to do these days in terms of reclaiming some of the things that for many of us maybe we've thrown out with the baby with the bathwater kind of deal, that we're sort of saying, well, no, I think there's reasons to engage these passages. And so we're taking a deep dive into each of these different stories and these different verses. And so when I was sitting with this, when I was imagining what would be a passage that I could dance with, a passage that I really need to reimagine, a passage that, to be honest with you, I haven't done a lot of work in or on in a lot of years, quickly John 14 came to mind. And for many of us in this space, I think we coalesce, we come together under a handful of identities and a handful of narratives that are probably relatively true for most of us here today. But I think if there were a stream of narrative that is definitely true for most of us here, if we could sort of go back into the previous environments with which we've come from in terms of our faith journeys, and I think for most of us, for most of us, that's been true. Every once in a while, there's a few of you that say, no, this is your first faith encounter. Welcome, good for you. You are so much further ahead than the rest of us. The hauntings of your past are not there like they are for us. But for most of us, we come from spaces that marked us in ways that were not only not helpful, but disturbing and hurtful, to say the least. And so for most of us in this space, we've come from an environment that said, if you were the inside group, if you believed a certain way, if you held to a certain set of understandings or assumptions, then you were in, then you were welcomed, then you were correct, then you were the faithful few, then you were the one that was on trajectory towards some kind of eternity based on some other bad kind of eternity. These were the narratives that most of us grew up with, or at least most of us in this space had an awareness of. Arguably, we see different today. So when I look at this story and this idea that for most of us, we come from a space that says you're in or you're out, and that was how you identified. And if you were in, the work of the people that were in were to sort of solicit and go out and reach out to the people who were out and help them understand how much their outness was bad, right? And they needed to come in and be a part of this sort of inness that we had figured out. Once you're in, and you're in long enough, you begin to realize behind the curtain it's a little bit jacked up and haunted. And so you begin to realize, wait a minute, I'm not sure this is what I want to be a part of. And then a whole bunch of stuff ensues, and everything falls apart, and you become angry, they become angry at you, and then you no longer are a part of being in, and you are now out. And this, for many of us, lands us through a very circuitous route into a watershed space, into a watershed community. John 14 might have been the central passage that has been weaponized over the years to propagate this idea that a certain select group are in while the rest are out. And maybe you're familiar with this passage. It goes like this. Jesus says these words, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And how many of you have heard this passage before? You're relatively aware of it, okay. Like I said, it's been weaponized, it's been used to control, to manipulate, and encircle a group that feels more empowered because they feel as though they have some kind of understanding or awareness unique to them that the rest of the world, that the vast majority do not have. That's sort of the disposition when this verse has been used over the years, that those of you who believe in Jesus and his way, you're in. If you believe in the way, in the truth and the life, as though somehow when we say the words truth and life, I get all of it. It makes sense. It's really clear now. Those two are very ambiguous statements. Yet somehow we think that we're in because that makes sense to us, when really when we stop to think about it, they're loaded terms. That no one comes to the Father, no one engages God except through Jesus. And this sense that if I believe, if I trust, if I hold to Jesus being true, then somehow I'm in. And on top of all of this sort of inness and outness narrative, this grid, we call it a hermeneutic, this filter with which we come to these kinds of texts, is laden with this idea that there is a heaven and a hell, and that certain people are in and certain people are out. And then if you believe a certain way, you're in, and if you don't believe that way, then you go to an eternal hell. And that grid has obsessively encompassed how we as modern evangelical Christians have seen and read and interpret so much of the scriptures, when arguably that is not at all the intentionality of Jesus in particular in this passage, and in general across the board. And so this morning, I want to humbly engage this passage. And I say humbly because I don't think for one second somehow I've got it figured out by any stretch of the imagination. But my hope would be that I can maybe stretch your imagination to say, well, maybe there is a different way to see this passage. Or maybe there's multiple ways of seeing this passage. And maybe the one that is not to be engaged is the idea that it's a future of a heaven or a hell or a group of people that are in or out. And so instead of weaponizing it, maybe this passage can be reclaimed and can be seen in a different way. It's important to understand. It's very, very important to understand. The Bible is written by storytellers, not historians. So storytellers have an agenda. They're trying to communicate something. They might not be necessarily concerned with making sure that their storytelling is completely historically accurate. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that they aren't concerned at all about historicity and accuracy. They're more concerned about attempting to communicate an idea, a notion, a concept, an agenda. And that is very, very true with the author of John, which we're not even sure if it was John himself, but arguably the person who was writing this passage has a very Jewish agenda. Again, which is fine. A very Christ-centered, Jesus-centered Jewish agenda, which is a whole other conversation for another time. But it's important to understand that the Bible is written by storytellers, not historians. So if I can this morning, let me take you on a small journey. Let me take you on a short journey. A journey that most of you have probably the sort of arc of understanding towards, but so John 14 is where this passage is found. John 14:6, the very beginning of John 14. But I want to back it up, if I can, to John 13. And for most of you, you're probably relatively aware of John 13. This is where we see the Last Supper, right? This is the upper room. This is where we see the Passover being celebrated in the Jewish customs and the Jewish traditions. And so Jesus and his 12 disciples are going to have a meal together. And probably this group of 13 were looking forward to this meal. They were looking forward to their time together. Somebody probably prepared it in an extra special way, and the drink was probably a little bit more top shelf than normally. And so the moment in terms of the disciples was going to be something that was going to be relatively enjoyable and meaningful. The disciples and Jesus have been together about 3 years at this point, so they've done a lot of work together. They spent a lot of time with Jesus. They've watched the work that he's done. And so here they are in this Last Supper, the upper room, the Passover, whatever you want to call it. This is just hours and maybe a day or so before Jesus ultimately dies and is crucified, or so the story says. And in this upper room experience, Jesus sort of offsets it, puts everything off, recenters the whole conversation by first washing the feet of the disciples. And like any of us, that was an awkward experience. I mean, somebody touches your feet, that's a very intimate kind of a thing. Your feet are dirty, and they're trying to get them washed. So the whole thing was off-putting to the disciples on the front end. And they were sort of saying, Jesus, if anything's going on here, we should be washing your feet, not the other way around. And they struggled to absorb that like any of us would. And then we see, as things are moving along, this whole experience becomes incredibly disruptive and distracting for the disciples because Jesus predicts Judas turning on him and turning him over to Rome and ultimately leading up to his death. And so, again, now all of a sudden, this foot washing experience, this meal was supposed to be something quite beautiful and elegant and a time together and a time of celebration. And now one of their own is going to turn on Jesus. And now there's division and there's this tension at the dinner space. And then we see Jesus predicting Judas turning him over, not only Judas turning him over to Rome, but we also see Peter's denial happening. So in this mealtime, in this matter of minutes or an hour or so, whatever's going on, a lot of disruptive narrative is happening. And then Jesus says this, near the end of John 13, "My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I have told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come." And so in the mind of the disciples, all of a sudden now, wait a minute, everything is blown up. You're saying our own crew here are going to turn on you. You're saying that you're going somewhere where we can't go. Why can't we go? After all, you're our stability. You're the thing that we're holding to. And what is Jesus saying here? Jesus is not saying I'm going to a different place and you can't show up and go with me physically. Jesus is saying where I am going to go, you can't go. I am going to suffer and die in the hours ahead, and you can't experience that with me right now. You can't go with me right now. And in a sense, Jesus is being a little bit cryptic with the disciples because arguably they're not ready to really hear that ultimately their future is also going to be in jeopardy. And we know history seems to prove that. And out of nowhere, so again, all this stuff is happening. Jesus washing feet, Judas turning him over to Rome, the story of Judas turning him over to Rome, Peter's denial, Jesus saying, I'm leaving and you can't go with me. All this stuff is incredibly disruptive. And out of nowhere, in verse 34, Jesus makes this statement, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." It's like the whole thing is turned upside down. He's saying, hey, for the record, I'm issuing you a new command, which, by the way, was not a new command. The Jewish tradition sort of coalesced everything down to at least two statements, one that you were to love God and you were to love each other. So it's not a new command. But Jesus has sort of taken the audacity and he's sort of taken the freedom to say, hey, let me issue something a different way. Let me invite you to love differently. And he seemingly is doing this, and the work that he did for the years leading up to this seemed illustrative of this. So he has this he's trying to reclaim this commandment of how we love well. And the disciples aren't hearing any of it. They're too consumed right now. And chapter 13 is loaded with this meal that is going completely sideways. And Jesus tosses out this verse, and it's almost as though they glossed over it. They don't even hear what he's having to say. Because after all, he's just wanting to refocus the disciples. Here's the deal, disciples. This is what I've invited you into. 3 years of work. Serve other people, washing feet. Love people that are hard to love people on the fringes, love people that are not in the same socioeconomic status as you are, love people that are not necessarily loved by those who are being centered. But they're more concerned about where Jesus is going. They didn't hear one word he said about what it means to love. In the next verse 36, Peter asked, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus replied, where I am going you cannot follow, but you will follow later. So what's going on here? What is Jesus saying? You're not ready to go on the journey of death and pain that I'm going on. But by the way, you will go on that journey. And again, Jesus is being cryptic here. I think he assumes the disciples are not ready to really hear what's going on. They did not, because here's what Jesus knows. If you introduce a kind of leadership that washes feet, it's disturbing. People don't like it. If you introduce the kind of love that says love people who are on the fringes, don't love those who are centered, the centered, powerful people don't like that. Because the work of Jesus was to love the prostitutes, the tax collectors, all the people who were sort of on the outside. And when you love people that way, when you love people like Jesus was saying here in the first part of chapter 13, love well and then they will know you're my disciples. When you do that kind of love, it resets the whole thing. And ultimately, it will cost you. People don't like it. The system doesn't like it. The structure does not like it. And Jesus knew that the disciples ultimately would follow him in his journey. They too, and we know history shows this, that most of the disciples died at the hands of a system in Rome that ultimately want them dead because the kind of love and the kind of thing that they were trying to introduce, Rome and the systems were not comfortable with. And so Peter says in verse 36, Lord, where are you going? Jesus replied, where I'm going you cannot follow, but you will follow later. They will follow later in their own death and their own pain. Verse 37, again, they're obsessed. Peter says, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Then Jesus says, and kind of sticks it in a little bit, will you really lay down your life for me? I mean, he's sarcastic. Like you tell, Jesus is really miffed right here. I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And it's so the disciples, you can get this, right? They're like, oh, Jesus, we've spent 3 years with you. You've been a security blanket. There's clearly codependence on him, right? You've met all our needs. You've provided for us. We've done these miracles together, and we've had these experiences together. And it's as though they're saying, Jesus, by you going away, we're losing our system. We're losing our infrastructure. The disciples are looking for a set of rules and information and statements and dogmas and theologies and concepts that allow them to somehow put their trust in those ideas, right? I mean, isn't that what we do? I can appreciate what the disciples are saying here. Wait a minute, they're not even hearing Jesus about washing feet and loving well and what that even means. All they're concerned is that their stability is going away, that their identity in Jesus is going away. And what Jesus is saying here is, guys, I need to give you the freedom. I need to turn you loose. You're putting too much into me. I need to actually free you up to find who God is in you. And we see in the moments here that happening in a very, very real way. This is so true of us. I remember a guy years ago who was here at Watershed. I've heard this a lot over the years. Early on, here at Watershed, we were a non-affirming community. I'm not proud of that, but that was part of our story. And as we were becoming affirming, this gay man who had been a part of our community for a couple of years at that point, who was incredibly gracious, who was sitting well with our tension of becoming affirming, but not fully there yet. And I remember him saying to us one Sunday, he said, so how should I believe? How should I see reality? And he would keep on asking us for what is truth, and you tell me how I should see reality. And we finally kept on saying to him, well, no, our role is not to tell you how to see your experience with faith and with God. That's something that you actually encounter. Now, we'll speak into that, but ultimately that's going to be your own journey. And he said, I can't be here if you can't tell me how I should see my faith journey. Now, that seems weird to us this far down the road, because most of you in this space, if I said to you, here's truth and here's reality and here's the only way you can see it, you'd be like, of course not, Scott, that's crazy. Because you're sort of trained in your own discovery these days, in your own journey. There's a maturity to your journey. But for most of us, we often love and long for this sense that, all right, I want to hold on to something. I need a structure. And what Jesus was saying here is, I am going away. Your structure is going away, and you're going to have to reimagine what that looks like. The disciples, they're stressed at this point. They're anxious. And Jesus is trying to sort of calm them down, but they're coming unraveled. Wait a minute, you're leaving us, Jesus. They keep on bringing up this idea that he is going away. They're not hearing anything else. This meal that was supposed to be something to be celebrated, they didn't know, but it was kind of this last time that they're all together, turned into a complete nightmare. So Jesus is trying to bring them relief. He's trying to bring them calm at the end of chapter 13. And again, remember, this is an intimate gathering. So it's not as though Jesus is sitting or standing before a crowd and saying, let me disseminate truth, and this truth is universal truth, and this truth is to be held to forever in the ages evermore, to never be edited or played with or dialogued over. That's not what's happening here. This is not where he's sitting down and somebody's canonizing the words that he's writing because the words he's saying are to be held as sort of truth forever. Not at all. This is a dinner table. Well, they're not probably on a table. They're probably sitting around more on pillows. There are probably a couple glasses of wine in, a lot of emotion, a lot of angst. They're afraid. There's fear. And Jesus is trying to say, and he opens up verse 1 of chapter 14. He says, disciples, guys, don't let your heart be troubled. You believe in God, right? I mean, you have this trust in the Christ, in this essence. Believe also in me. Believe in what I say. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? So when I read this passage, Jesus is trying to calm the room. He's trying to calm the space. But then when I read this passage with my evangelical grid, my Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, I would have told you. So Watershed, if you put on your evangelical hat from where you've come from, when you read this passage, what is it that you think, or where is it that you think Jesus is going? What is he going to do to prepare? Again, from your perspective, where is he going? Somebody say heaven? Yeah, right? Because, again, we were taught that this passage was very much about Jesus is going ahead of us to prepare big mansions, depending on how faithful you are, or little huts if you weren't very faithful, right? There's the golden streets, and maybe you got a silver line street because you weren't as faithful, whatever it was, right? So there was this whole grid, this whole economy we built on a future heaven based on these kinds of passages. And I'm not sure, though, that's what Jesus is saying here. He says, my Father's house has many rooms. If we're not so, I would have told you. So I think it's important to understand, well, when we say Father's house, when Jesus says Father's house, what does he mean by this? So we've been in chapter 13, been dinner time, right? Still at dinner time. We're entering chapter 14. Just for a second, hang with me. I'm going to jump to chapter 2. Same book, John. Same writer, uses the same language. In John 2, another very familiar story most of you probably are gently aware of. This is where Jesus goes into the temple courts, and he wreaks havoc on the temple courts, where he's flipping over the money changers. He's flipping over the people trying to sell all the sort of God paraphernalia accessory wear, right? Because if you're showing up to the temple, you might have commuted like a couple countries away. Or you're showing up seasonally with your family or with your tribe or by yourself. And when you show up, you are looking to buy wares, to buy purified animals that you are now going to sacrifice, and they are overcharging on pricing. And Jesus is frustrated. Why? Because the Jewish community is not only being oppressed by Rome, but they don't have anything. They have no resources. And so for their own people to take advantage of themselves, of each other, this is why Jesus gets so miffed. It's really a statement of justice. And so Jesus turns over the tables, and we're in John 2, and he says these words. To those who have sold doves, he said, get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market. So quickly jump ahead to 14. My Father's house is not Father's house like heaven. Father's house is the temple. So what is going on here? The temple. So hang with me here. Chapter 2. Jump ahead a couple more verses. Jesus is still having some dialogue going on here. And he says, John 2:19, Jesus answered, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. They replied, it has taken 46 years to build the temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days. But the temple he has spoken of was his body. So in chapter 2, Jesus is saying some pretty pronounced things. The author of John is saying some pretty intense things that at first, the Father's house is the temple. It's not heaven. It's not some kind of future heaven. And that Jesus' body is now the new temple. I mean, Jesus is saying this. Now, it's important to understand there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in history here, so hang with me. So we're gonna jump back to John 14, all right? So we're back in John 14 right now. John 14, happening somewhere around 80, 90 to 80, 110. About 50, 60, 70 years after Jesus' death, this is being written. That's why I'm not even sure if John is writing it, because he might be dead and gone, but there's a good chance he could be still writing this. The assumption of the day is this. Paul, if you're familiar with the New Testament, wrote a bunch of New Testament text, and he had already written his stuff before this is being written. So the Pauline narrative, the idea of what Paul is writing about, is pervasive in this season, this time. Paul writes no less than 5 different times in his different writings that we are the temple. You're probably relatively familiar with this. So in John 14, when the author is writing about this space, my Father's house, people are keenly aware that, well, my Father's house is the temple, and they're keenly aware that Jesus is is sort of updating and changing things and saying, hey, the temple is me, and God resides in me. And the prominent narrative of the day is also, you are the temple, and God is also in you. The disciples would have known this. This would have been part of their understanding, their assumption. It's also important to understand, one more piece of small history, and I'll get off of it. 80, 70, about 20, 30 years before John is written, the temple is destroyed. Rome is sick and tired of Judaism and the Jewish nag that's going on, and they oppress it and they crush it and they destroy the temple. So now the temple is no longer a physical space, quite literally. So for people to hold on to the idea that they are the temple, that Jesus is the temple, and that God resides in both those essences and those realities was a very welcoming and common new idea. And so when Jesus is having this conversation about, I am going to prepare a place for you, I am going ahead of you, I am going to die and suffer in advance of you, and you're coming behind me in this narrative, and I'm going to prepare a place. In other words, I'm going to set in motion the reality that already is, the reality that you already know, the reality that God is realized in me, says Jesus. Oh, and by the way, you already know this, disciples. God is realized in you. You're all freaked out. You're all worked up. But you already have this infrastructure. You already have this interior. You already have this connection that God is already in you. Another quick small piece of history, when you read the book of John, it's important to understand that when John is writing, he's not writing in a literal sense, in the physical sense. He's very much speaking to the spiritual narrative. That's how he writes. That's how he was seeing reality. He was not concerned about the physicality. He was more assuming on the reader that he was speaking about the space and the idea of spirit. So the idea of a physical temple being gone and you being the temple and God being centered in you is very much lined up with how John is writing. We are the new temple where God resides. God's realized in us. And here's also what's happening. End of first century, Paul is expecting Jesus to physically return, to literally resurrect, show up one day and come back on the earth. And it hadn't happened yet. As far as I know, it still hadn't happened. But it hadn't happened at this point either. And Paul you can tell there's this frustration within this new Christian way that's saying, where is Jesus? He hasn't shown up yet. And the author of John is saying, yes, he has. He's here in you. He doesn't need to show up physically. He's here in you. You are the temple. The Christ resides in you. Of course, the disciples aren't hearing this right now. They're all stressed out because Jesus, after all, is leaving them. Jump ahead to chapter 14, verse 3. Hang with me here. 14:3. And if I go and prepare a place for you, says Jesus, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. So if you read this verse, it's very much about a future tense and a present tense simultaneously. And I will go and prepare a place for you, and I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am, in the present now. The idea that Jesus is going to die and go forward, and his Spirit is going to reside and be with them then, in the moment, not just in the future, not a future heaven, not a future hell if you don't go to heaven, not some kind of future building, some future kind of golden street. In the moment that the Spirit is going to return and be in that space now. And again, remember, John's focus is on the Spirit, not the physical. And again, I think it's really important to understand here that Jesus is talking about a lot of stuff. He ain't talking about heaven or hell. He's not talking about an elite group who are in and an elite group who are out. But again, we see in verse 5, just before we get to verse 6, the crux of the whole thing. Verse 5, Thomas said, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? They're still talking. They're still obsessed about Jesus. Where are you going? What's going on? They're obsessing over it. We do the same thing. We constantly are like, yeah, okay, fine, whatever. We're the temple and the Christ and the essence that resides in us. That's fine. But really, how should we believe? But tell me how I should see reality, right? That's often so how we live. The disciples, like they need some Prozac. Like they're coming undone, right? They need another glass of wine. They are so stressed out at this point. Everything that they have worked for and lived for, as far as they know, is leaving. They're losing some of their own friends. The dozen is going away. Their leader, their point person is going away. They don't even know where he's going. They still think he's going somewhere, but Jesus is cryptically he hasn't unloaded all of that yet because it would be way too much for them to absorb. They're anxious, they're stressed. And again, remember, they're at an intimate gathering, a dinner table, not sitting on the floor. They're hanging out. They're laid back in a sense. This is not some formal setting where they're trying to canonize the words of Jesus. And so Jesus is saying, all right, disciples, you're freaked out. You're stressed out that I'm going to go somewhere. You're looking for a way to be. You're looking for a way, and I've been telling you all along that you have everything you need inside of you. That the God, the temple that is you, it holds the Christ internally. You have all of this, and somehow you're not hearing it. I'm inviting you to love well. I'm inviting you to care about those on the edges of culture and society. But you're not even hearing that. You're concerned about where I'm going. You're concerned about the system. So let me calm you down. So I'll tell you what you need to hear. I am the way. I'm the truth. I'm the life. And what he doesn't say parenthetically here is, so are you, disciples. Because you have the same thing. You have the same kind of spirit possessing you that I have. But you're not ready to hear that yet because you just need to be reinforced. And oh, by the way, no one comes to the Father except through me. Parenthetically, but you already have access to the Father because you are the temple, and the Father already resides in you. The Christ, the essence of all that is, already resides in you. And it's as though Jesus is saying, all right, you need me to give you a specific grid with which you need to see reality right now? I get that. I'll give that to you. I mean, it's going to unravel here in the days ahead. Not only am I going to be dead and gone, but so will you in the years ahead. They were so stressed. They want to know where he's going. In this passage, I think it would be ostentatious of us to think that Jesus is somehow making some kind of universal statement that we are to rest all of Christendom on. When at the end of the day, he's attempting to maybe satiate the pain that these disciples are going through. It's as though he told them what they needed to hear. That Jesus himself was more credible than they were. And again, here's what's sort of moving about this passage. So how do we reclaim this passage? Is it a passage about heaven and hell and Jesus going ahead of us to heaven and setting up the house for us? No. By no means is it that. Exactly what is it? I don't know. It's up for discussion. There's probably 10 or different translations that we could play with, and I think that'd be a lot of fun. But what it's not is a future heaven or hell. But here's what Jesus goes on to say. And so in terms of how we reclaim this passage, what if we can look at it from a couple different perspectives? This one, so if you go to a few verses ahead in chapter 14, hang with me, I'm almost done here. A few verses ahead in chapter 14, like 7 or 8 verses. Chapter 14, verse 12, Jesus says these words, "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing. And they will do even greater things than these because I am going to the Father." I mean, Jesus is saying here, because I'm leaving you, and I'm going to leave my Spirit, you're going to actually do a greater work than I've ever done. It's almost as though Jesus is saying, because I'm getting out of your way, you're putting way too much trust in me and not letting the Spirit actually work in you. So ironically so, Jesus is saying, actually, it's not about putting trust in me. It's about putting trust in the Spirit that already possesses you. Do you see the difference? Like, wait a minute, this is not a passage about who's in or who's out. No, it has nothing to do with that. As a matter of fact, it's actually a passage about that. Ironically, it says we're all in. You're all possessed by a good spirit. You're all possessed by this essence that has created all that is. Call it the Christ, call it whatever deity form that you need. It's something that imbibes you, and it drives us, or it's inviting us to live out a different kind of way. A way of love, a way of serving, a way of caring for people that typically are not loved and cared for, that are not centered. That's kind of the second point of what it means to reclaim this. And then there's a third point here that I kind of read this a couple days ago, and I don't even have a slide for it. And this idea of subversive resistance. This idea of, you've ever heard the word gospel? I'm absolutely convinced we have no idea what it really means, because it's such a thing to be played with, and the word to be interpreted and played with and sort of discovered. But one of my favorite thinkers wrote, in terms of how he interprets the word gospel, the gospel is the divine announcement that you are loved and accepted exactly as you are, that everything has been taken care of. This is where, like, Jesus saying, the gospel is, disciples, it's going to be okay. That I'm not leaving you alone. That everything has been taken care of. That everything has been everything you've been striving for to earn has been yours the entire time. That you belong in exactly this condition that you currently are in. Nothing additional required, nothing needed. That you're looking for all these grids to say, wait, how do you believe? Wait, Watershed, you're progressive. Okay, I'm being progressive. But here's the deal, guys. This progressive narrative, it's going to go away, right? In 5 or 10 years or 15 years. Some people will hold to it and die to it because they think that's where the reality should be. It's going to be something different. I've been doing this for 33 years. I've experienced a few of these things, and I've held way too closely and too tightly to some of these ways of seeing reality. But maybe whatever the new progressive is going to be, that's going to be the new thing that we sort of jump to, and we hold it loosely, and we evolve into the next thing, right? In essence, what Jesus is inviting us into is a sense that we can love really well and need to. That the spirit that possesses us is not a spirit that's trying to control us, that's trying to say, believe a certain way, hold to a certain set of standards, hold to a certain set of assumptions. It's absolutely way more broad than that. It's all are in, all are welcome. Now we get to do the work of waking up to what does it mean to imbibe the spirit that does possess us. That this essence, that this Christ, that this Logos, that is the center of who we are. What's that look like? And what's it begin to live that out? What's it mean to live that out here in Charlotte? At Watershed, and as a community, as a family that grows and loves together. Let me pray with you. Father, Christ, this essence that is here in all of us. We're grateful that we get to dance this dance and play this way and to reimagine, to rediscover. Thank you for the men and women and the people in this space who speak so beautifully into what this looks like and show grace towards this and live out this kind of gospel, this kind of love, and this kind of way automatically. That the spirit that possesses them is living very real in a very real way through them. Thank you for the journey that we get to play and dance and engage. May we come away from these kinds of talks in this series with humility, embracing the stories and the text, realizing that there's something worth reclaiming here, that's worth reimagining. And so when we say we love you, we speak truth into that we love this essence and this center, that this God, that this deity that is possessing us. We're grateful for it. Amen.
Well, I'm having trouble sleeping and I'm stuck on my side. 'Cause I hadn't figured out this faith of mine. But the problem isn't sitting on a wooden pew. It's the digging through the dark parts we've been through. So be still, you don't always have to have the answer. Be still, you'll be fine with a little bit of doubt. So be still, you don't always have to have the answer. Well, I'm figuring out, you don't always have to figure it out. I'm listening hard for the voice in the room, like a baby wishing with a barren womb. So I'm staring down into the eyes of fear, 'cause I've learned to hear with more than ears. So be still, you don't always have to have the answer. Be still, you'll be fine with a little bit of doubt. So be still, you don't always have to have the answer. Well, I'm figuring out, you don't always have to figure it out. I found beauty in the mystery. There are some things we will never see. You don't always have to have the answers to everything. I found beauty in the mystery. There are some things we will never see. You don't always have to have the answers to everything. So be still, you don't always have to have the answers. Be still, be fine with a little bit of doubt. So be still, you don't always have to have the answers. Well, I'm figuring out, you don't always have to figure it out. So be still, you don't always have to have the answer. Be still, you'll be fine with a little bit of doubt. So be still, you don't always have to have the answer. Well, I'm figuring out, you don't always have to figure it out.
I want to sing this chorus one more time. And as Scott mentioned, the anxiety of the disciples in that space. I don't know about you, but I felt that anxiety. The fear of not getting it right. And so this song says, be still. That maybe the opposite of anxiety is not being right or having it all together. But maybe, and so as we close this morning, I want to invite you to a moment of stillness. We're just going to sing this over you a few more times. If you want to close your eyes, you can. Take a posture that makes sense for you, but I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to take some deep breaths, be still. Allow the place of doubt to sit a little bit.
So be still, you don't always have to have the answers. Be still, you'll be fine with a little bit of doubt. So be still, you don't always have to have the answers. Well, I'm figuring out, you don't always have to figure it out. To be still, you don't always have to have the answers. Be still, you'll be fine with a little bit of doubt. So be still, you don't always have to have the answers. But I'm figuring out, you don't always have to figure it out.
God, may we be people that are comfortable and okay with the stillness. Allow us to hold the tension of doubt and allow that doubt to grow us, to seek out this place in us that is divine, that is holy, that has the capacity to love our enemies, that has the capacity to share and be gracious and be kind. And may it stir us to action. May it change who we are. May it move us to this place of resistance, to this place of looking for ways to love differently. We thank you, God, for this space, this community, this room where we can hold all of our doubts and hold our opinions and move forward with them and through them and around them, and just have a sense of graciousness to sit next to people that don't look like us, that don't think like us, that are different than us, and know that we are better because of those differences. We're grateful, God. Pray this in your name. Amen. Thank you so much for being here this morning. We're grateful for you contributing to this space, to this room, to this community, and we want to welcome you back next week as we continue this series. Hope you have a great Sunday. We'll see you next week.